All right, well, let's get started. If you guys all could take your seats. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Really appreciate you coming. This is going to be a great night. So, first of all, thank you to our host, Fidelity Center for Applied Technologies, and Ray Payson. And thank you to our food and beverage sponsors, Gravis Law, Niche, Ropes and Gray, and Fireblocks. For those of you that are new to the Boston Blockchain Association, we're passionate about the vision for blockchain technologies around the world. Our mission is to advance blockchain technologies, establish Massachusetts as a global hub, and support and connect blockchain professionals with useful resources. Our corporate members are Algorand, Deloitte, Ropes and Gray, Copper, Masstech Collaborative, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Arrival Bank, Odgers Berndsen, Niche, Media Shower, Provenance, ToposAware, and Access. And there's plenty of room for more. If you want to get involved, you can certainly join as an individual member, as a corporate member, and serve as a volunteer. We're always looking for volunteers. The BostonBlockchainAssociation.com has all of that information. If you're going to be sharing information tonight, use the hashtag BostonBlockchain. A couple events coming up that I wanted to talk about. The 2023 Institutional Digital Asset Adoption 4-part series that's being sponsored by Deloitte and Algorand. We've already had the first one of that, May 23rd at the Boston Fed. It was extremely effective and successful. You can go to the BBA LinkedIn page and see the recap video from that event. There were some really good sound bites and takeaways from that. The next event is August 10th at Greenberg Trorig. It's a workshop, 50 people, invitation only. If you'd like an invitation, let me know. And then October 17th at the Top of the Prue, sponsored by Ropes and Gray. And then finally, December 4th, the second annual Digital Asset Adoption Series with the TAB Group at District Hall. So with that, we're going to start our main event, Project Hamilton Lookback. Thank you so much to our speakers for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. I have the duty of being your moderator today. My name's Jack Fletcher. I work for a company called R3. I'm head of policy and GovRel for digital currencies. It's great to be here. This is actually the second time I've been to Boston. The first time was an absolute flying visit. Second time, I gave myself a bit of wandering around space, and I've noticed, to my surprise and horror, that there is a great monument to Anglo-American relations in this very city. It's called Boston Tea Party Museum and Shop. And as I walked past it today, there were children throwing tea into the harbour. I can only hope it's Tetley's. That's a tea joke for those of you that like a tea joke. With me today, I've got a fantastic panel. They've actually perfectly sat in the right order because that reflects my notes, which is just a good omen. Before I start, we've got some questions that we'll run through. We're also going to reward those of you that contributed to the meetup site by asking questions in there. So the two questions we'll take that are outside of our kind of plan stuff will be from there, so thank you. Now onto my intro. So we have Roy Ben-Hur, sat to my immediate left. Roy is the, I can't read my own writing, which is, I'm sure, something.
So I'll take the lead here.
Well, maybe you should do that. That would work out really nicely.
Nice to be here, and I think it's the second time I've at least been at a BBA event. So again, thank you for hosting us. I lead Deloitte's blockchain and digital asset for our advisory business, focusing on financial services clients only. And I've been in this space since what seems to be eons, from 2015, with the growth of the industry. Again, just happy to be here and see how the industry grows.
which is fantastic because it's exactly what I've got written here. What you didn't
Yeah.
say
Yeah.
is 23 years.
I didn't want to age myself.
No, well, you started very young, I'm sure. Your pivotal role in the RLM project is hopefully something we'll comment upon too. And that work was released. I don't know if any of you saw the presentation a few weeks ago that you guys did with that. Jamil Sheikh is sat to Roy's left. Jamil is the founder and CEO of Siphon, formerly Chainhouse. He has many roles, an author, professor, and community builder. Indeed, you have a role with the New York equivalent of the Boston Blockchain Foundation. 30 years across capital markets in banking and tech, time at JPM, Bank of America, Citi and Lehman, and adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, Zicklin Business School, amongst a handful of others. Jamil, as hopefully he will talk to today, is into the really exciting stuff in these business schools. So teaches in blockchain, AI, and machine learning. Jim, I'm sure will need no introduction to many of you. 30 years at the Boston Fed, culminating in a role as exec vice president and acting COO. Absolutely pivotal in the establishment of the world-class tech research group that the Boston Fed has, which collaborated with MIT on the Digital Currency Institute on Project Hamilton. So thank you very much, Jim, for being here. Also the founder of the Kuna consultancy, which you launched in April. And then Nia
Just take a quick picture of him. I still do LinkedIn.
Oh,
so.
good. Well, there you go. And then finally, and certainly not leastly, Neil Narula, director of the DCI at the MIT Media Labs, a member of the New York Innovation Advisory Board, New York Fed Innovation Advisory Board, member also previously of PayPal's Blockchain and DC Advisory Council, 7 years at Google, PhDs from MIT and a master's from there too, and absolutely a kind of world-recognized leader in the digital currency space. So thank you all for being with us today. With that, I will then kick off my questions, and perhaps it's best to start with you, Nia, and please feel free to chip in, Jim, on Project Hamilton itself, and perhaps you can just begin by saying what it is, what its aims were, and then we can kind of at least set the scene for those of us that might be a bit slower, like myself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you all for joining us today. I don't actually work for a Federal Reserve Bank, but I've learned that it's probably pretty smart to preface everything by saying nothing I'm saying represents, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston or the Federal Reserve Board of Governors or anything like that. So I'm just speaking in my own individual capacity here and talking about a research project that we did, which was very exciting in collaboration with this gentleman to my right, Jim Cunha, who I'm sure will add his own color and stories to it. So the Digital Currency Initiative, which is the group at MIT that I lead, has been thinking about the future of money since 2015. And, it was as early as 2016 that we started working on this area where you think about, well, okay, everyone's talking about things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, these cryptocurrencies, but when I think about the money that's in my wallet, in my accounts, what I transact in every day, well, for me, it's the dollar, and if you're in London, it's probably the pound. If you're in Europe, it's the euro. Sovereign money is actually quite important, and in fact, affects most of the world, far, far, far more of the world than cryptocurrencies do, at least today. And so when we think about the future of money, when we think about upgrading money and solving so many of the problems that we see in the world related to speed, security, resiliency, but also, functionality, what we can do with our money, I don't think you can just leave it in the cryptocurrency space. So despite the fact that we spend a lot of time there and we're quite excited about that technology, we've always been interested in figuring out how to upgrade sovereign money as well. So 2016, is when we first started having these conversations and spoke to folks like Jim. But then fast forward to 2020, when then Governor Brainerd made a speech announcing a research project that we were going to be doing together, and that it was termed Project Hamilton. And something that I think was very nice about the name is that it was named not only for Alexander Hamilton, who all of you should know from the musical, and if you haven't seen it yet, go see it. But also for perhaps someone a little bit lesser known, though just as important, Margaret Hamilton, who was an engineer on the Apollo project and a software engineer at the time, which meant actually writing and dealing with, a lot of punch cards and things like that. But so I thought it was really nice to kind of think about that joint naming, and all credit goes to Jim and his team for coming up with that. It was really brilliant. Our mission, our research question. So first of all, what we did together was research. I want to be very clear about that. As far as I know, no one in the United States has made any decisions about whether or not to issue a digital currency. But what we were doing was really, trying to understand how to answer some fundamental questions, trying to do some research, and specifically technology research. So really looking at the technology stack that might underpin something like this to gain more learning and knowledge. So really it was about gaining learning and knowledge. And again, kudos to Jim's team for really focusing it down, saying, there's so much we could do here. We don't want to boil the ocean. Let's focus on just moving money. Let's just focus on the core process of moving money quickly and securely and with great resilience. And let's focus on trying to create a research platform that we can then build upon in the future. And so that was the origin of Project Hamilton, and that's what we all came together to do. One of the things I'm most proud of from the project is, I don't know this for sure, but it appears to be the first time that the Federal Reserve System has released open source code. So that was something that we were very adamant about, that we wanted to do everything that we did out in public so people could see it, they could see exactly what it did, and they could even run it themselves. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that, but maybe I'll let Jim jump in.
A few things. First of all, we started doing blockchain experimentation back in 2015. It wasn't called that then, but we basically built a wholesale CBDC. Very small scale, but we used Ethereum when it wasn't yet production, and then Hyperledger Fabric. But that was to understand blockchain. This was really understand how to make digital money. How do you really do it? And it's not just about making it and making it move, but making it work at scale and resiliently, which is the hard part. And never lose any data, have total data integrity. So that's what's so hard about it, is doing all those three things together. And a bit about the, I said we did a wholesale CBDC early on, but we were a bunch of volunteers. And we were trying to figure out what to do next. And then we were asked to come up with some new ideas. And I had two employees now working with me, and I said, give me some ideas. And anybody's worked for me, I always say, give me three. Give me a boring one, an exciting one, and one that scares my boss. And Hamilton was the scare my boss one. And I gave it to my president, and he says, okay, let's go sell it. We had to sell it in Washington. So it was a scare my boss, and I said, I was telling Niehaus, the best project I've worked on in 38 years at the Fed. And the goal of the open source was also to share it and hopefully do something which is, let's change people's minds and not just look at building something that looks like a payment system. If you look under the covers, Hamilton looks more like an open CBDC, looks more like Bitcoin than a regular payment system. And that was by design, so it's a little bit of background.
Yeah, and I think it was sort of touched upon, but I think there is something fairly unique about what happened here with Hamilton, and I guess I'm sort of pointing at the kind of collaboration that happens quite rarely, really, with the Fed and outside organizations. I guess two-parter, how is it that came about, and do you think it can be replicated going forward?
Well, it came about because Neha reached out to me. We had a couple of conversations. It was just advisory, and then they had a couple of I call them advisory groups, one on technology and policy, and it was just some central banks around the world. We started getting involved with that, and then when we came up for the idea of trying to actually build something, it was only natural that we turn to the DCI. They have. What's different was I had engineers. I had some cloud people. I had engineers, one of the best in the world. They came out of MIT, James Lovejoy, and then there's engineers. So the first time I know that a central bank and a university actually coded together as they were one team, and it was an experiment. These are people that code Bitcoin, the co-developer of Zcash, the developer of Lightning Network. They're going to work with the Fed, and we were both shocked. It worked really well. We had times was hard because I had to break down the policy walls. The hard part is the policy side of it. Is really, I should have said now I'm retired, so I can. These are my words. I can say anything I want. It's really hard to get something like this approved at a central bank. It's really hard, and for me, it was just the luck of the timing and perseverance and everything else, and having the name that people knew of the DCI and DC. So I think it was a combination of things, and I'd say it'd be hard to replicate it like we did. Not that we can't have partnerships, we should, but this kind of, we're both jointly, and we both have intellectual property for the technology, which I don't know if it's ever happened before.
Yeah, and I'd love to touch on some of the policy stuff a little bit later on, but Ben, I can see you're itching.
I don't want to inject the discussion, but building upon that, so regulated liability network, we had 10 financial services regulated and the New York Innovation Center in this public-private, and they use the same collaboration. We use partnership, and we were told by higher-ups we cannot use partnership, but we use collaboration. But I think the lessons learned from Hamilton, we're taking it to there, where the private and the public area working together to come up with a solution. So they actually acknowledge the fact that they've taken some of the lessons learned out of Hamilton and used that to drive the adoption of it. So maybe it's kind of the second time that they've used that.
Yeah. And I don't mean negative on the opportunity. I think something the size and the scope of Hamilton would be a bit hard, but I'm a dreamer, so I would never say never. But I do hope we still do more work with the Fed and the DCR, still do more work going forward.
So, Ben, you touched upon the RLN, and perhaps it's worth sort of broadening out to the audience what that project was, because it really, in many respects, is seeking to address the other side, I guess, of how money works. There is the public money and there's private money, and the RLN was looking very sort of, with collaboration with New York, the Innovation Center, but looking at that private money side of it.
Well, yes and no. I'll start with that. So Hamilton was technology-driven. The regulated liability network, again, born out of the idea that came out of Citi back in Q3 of 2021, and then brought up to the Fed, or the New York Innovation Center of the Fed, which is the equivalent of the BIS, on the idea of having regulated banks and non-banks, but all regulated entities operated together on a 24/7, 365 single ledger and allowing the movement of money. But the problem was a business and legal problem, and then we said we're going to look in technology. First, agree on building the consortium, agreeing between the members what we want to do, what's the use case we want to unpack, then clearly looking at the legal permissibility of it, finality of settlement, can we do it within U.S. rails? The first use cases that the industry, so when I use the term we, again, it's not Deloitte, it's the industry members, explored was on-chain US dollar movements domestically and then cross-border. But it was led by what's the business we want to solve for? Is this something that RLN will provide benefit compared to what's existing today? Can we apply the legal permissibility to it? And on top of it, okay, now let's go ahead and select the technology and make sure it can happen. But the notion behind it was it's technology agnostic. So you can run it on any ledger, any database. Presumably, you can run it even on just normal CBDC, SQL databases. So that was one of the items that the project explored.
And so I guess with that, do you see a day when maybe we'll take aside whether it's Project Hamilton specifically, but do you see these two ends meeting? Do you envisage a world whereby we might have a project or a program that looks at how those two interplay with each other?
I believe we will. So the idea behind it is having tokenized bank deposits with wholesale CBDC, equivalent to wholesale CBDC or central bank tokenized coins in the middle, and that's how the transaction is done. So presumably, an Hamilton-based technology could sit in the middle, and that will be managed by the central bank. Each bank will tokenize their own money. They will operate on their own network. The idea behind it, and I think it's been socialized and discussed in the last couple of weeks as well, is having an interoperability layer that will allow for multiple networks to operate and live. And I know R3 has been speaking about this as well, because you cannot select a single winner. So Hamilton could be a solution that will sit in the middle and support the central bank platform.
And I'm going to go fishing for controversy here. Is that a shared opinion from across the panel? Is there one coin to rule the world?
No, I don't think. I don't think there's one coin to rule the world, but I do think, every effort I've been working with central banks is everybody is talking about the interoperability and how do the things interconnect, and there's very little of that today. And people presume in all these CBDCs that they'll talk to traditional payment systems, and I question how. Because nothing talks today to each other, at least not in the States, maybe in the EU. There's always an intermediary. So with a layer, since we're starting from scratch, I think that would be, definitely a worthy goal, but it's hard, and a lot of the risks sometimes come at the intermediary levels of these things. So, great goal, and we should definitely be trying to do it. It's the hard part.
And Jamil, perhaps I can send to you. You've taken or working with some of what's come out of Hamilton in the Open CBDC sort of project. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah, and I guess I'm sort of interested in what that looks like, where you think it's addressing needs, and what you think even actually the future of it looks like.
Sure. So I run an organization called CBDC Think Tank, and that organization engages with lots of different central banks. Globally, we do advisory. We have a bunch of banks that have publicly worked with us, and a lot of banks are working with us privately. And I remember the day the announcement came out for Open CBDC, which is the open source platform under Project Hamilton. And then we got this significant amount of international inbound to us to say, hey, what is this thing? And then we had to figure it out. Let's look at this. We went through the paper. That same day, the paper came out. And then I went through the source code. It was written in C++ 17, which is rare. Like, not a lot of people are starting projects with C++. So I'm opening up my C++ book. I'm like, what is this? And I have a team of developers. We've got 50 developers. And I allocated a few developers. Like, look at this. What is this? And how do we use it? One was like, this was very sophisticated stuff. We thought it was, James Lovejoy, Jim mentioned, we looked at it and was like, this looks like Bitcoin, right? And it's maybe a centralized version of Bitcoin. So these other central banks are coming to us and asking us for, like, how do we play with this? How do we use it? How do we understand it? How do we experiment with it? And it was incredibly complex to launch and to run and to use and to manage, like any other software might be, enterprise software might be. So we rolled out a sandbox, right? So, okay, you can come in and click and you can launch this thing with a UI and you're up and running. And it would allow you to learn about what a CBDC could look like. You could learn about what privacy might look like on a CBDC and what are the different features that you might want, and you can start to investigate. And a lot of these banks, central banks, were concerned about the fact that their alternatives were not open source, right? And so the fact that a CBDC platform is not open source can mean there may be state actors injecting things in that and all that. And so by saying this is open source, they allow them to come and look at that and say, well, now I can see a potential product. But at that time, Open CBDC was not something that you could run and put into production and run your economy on, right? It was something, it was experimental. I remember, I think one of my developers found a bug and we committed some.
That's why it's open source.
That's why it's open source. We put in a pull request and things like that. And we were looking at, this might be a product in the future, and it'll need services and things like that. And so we were angling for that. But then the product that we built, the sandbox, pivoted. We moved towards making Open CBDC a virtual thing. So you spun up a virtual version of Open CBDC, which was less taxing in terms of infrastructure costs. It was less taxing in terms of scalability and be able to get a faster ROI in terms of learning about CBDCs. And then we added in later AI and machine learning components. And actually this year we integrated pieces of that into ChatGPT. So you build all these parameters and you push it into ChatGPT and then you query it. So it's kind of evolved. And then the day that Jim announced his retirement was a very sad day. And so we went back to the drawing. What's that? We went back to the drawing board a little bit.
Well, just to be clear, Open CBDC still exists. It's still being maintained and still.
Yeah, and maybe just to respond a little bit to what Jamil said, this is the first time I've even heard this story about, this is just the beauty of an open source project, right? So we put something out there into the world that was not a fully fledged production system by any means. It was a research project done by a small handful of engineers, and we tried to message it that way. But once we put it out there, other people can pick it up and do whatever they like with it. And that is a beautiful, amazing thing, and it's wonderful. And I think the only negative is that sometimes we don't even know when people are using it, because they don't even need to tell us that they're using it, right? It's just git clone on GitHub, and they're off and running into the races. And so it's been really interesting. We've had, so many different central banks and other actors kind of eventually come to us, and we find out that they've been running it, or they've been doing something, or they found these problems, and we're like, wow, we had no idea that you were using it. So it's really amazing.
Are you aware of some? I'm only curious because I'm not, in tune anymore. Are you aware of some particular projects that are underway?
Yeah, I know a lot of central banks have experimented with it and are continuing to experiment with it, but I don't want to, say anything else about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just might add one more point,
Yeah.
which is the fact that some of the central banks that we do talk to, some of them are smaller, maybe medium size, they're looking to America to, I asked them, what do you want to do with CBDCs? And their response is, we're waiting for America to.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what, and they're like, we want to see what America does, what the U.S. does, and then we want to maybe adopt some of that or all of that, right? And so I spend a lot of time in Asia. I'm not going to mention any countries, but that is kind of the response. And I think, and so what Jim has done, what Neha has done in terms of MIT is put something out there, has moved the needle in terms of discussion, like where we are today versus where we were 2 years ago around our understanding of what CBDCs and central banks understanding their internal competency has changed. And I think a big portion of that has been because of projects like what Jim has produced. Right? So their ability to come in and ask better questions has changed drastically over the past 2 years. Right? They're asking better things, right? And I think that's one of the benefits, is kind of move the needle, not just within the U.S., but also outside the U.S. as well.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it's actually sort of prompts a question I had sort of slated for a bit later on here, but whilst we're sort of talking about it, I guess the theme of the question is, what is the role of America here in a global context, and to what degree does the activity that comes from this nation influence others? So I'm particularly interested in, a brief plug, R3 is engaged in several different CBDC projects, and actually it's really interesting that you think that there's a kind of a deference to some activity that might happen here, because I think certainly from some nations there is absolutely an appetite to get on with it whilst they can, and when America joins the game, but absolutely that is kind of jurisdictionally sort of depending on attitudes. So I guess maybe if I could start sort of my immediate left and come back round again, where do you see the role for US leadership? Is there a role for US leadership in CBDC?
Go ahead.
Sorry, you want to go?
Yeah, we'll go this way.
I think that's a really complicated question, because on the one hand, I think from a technology perspective and from a finance perspective, America has traditionally taken a very strong leadership role, right? And in terms of innovation, America has taken a very strong leadership role, and I think that will continue to be the case. But from the perspective of, well, the way our currency exists in the world and the role that it plays in the international financial system has a very important role, and you don't want to mess with that. And so the way that I think the parts of the U.S. that care about this think about risk and think about financial stability, you don't want to move too fast. You don't want to be first, right? Because the dollar is unique in the world right now. It just is. It's completely unique in the world right now, and that's not the place where you're going to move fast and break things. Absolutely not. And so I think there's this tension between wanting to be the technology innovator that we are, and at the same time knowing that we have a massive responsibility on our shoulders, and sort of, how do you play with this dynamic? How do you let maybe the private sector run fast and free, but at the same time think about risk and think about the role that the dollar plays in the world? It's really hard to manage this.
It's really interesting thinking about where innovation lies within America. Does it lie naturally within the private sector? And to what role does the public sector, how comfortable is it with innovation? Now, Hamilton's a really great example of actually where it says we're comfortable in this space. But I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, and what Neha said about, it was exactly what the chairman said, Chairman Powell, was we don't have to be first, we have to be right. But so, that said, I personally think we should be spending a lot more time and money on this, because a lot of innovation in the private sector but a lot of innovation out of publicly funded initiatives, space program, telephone systems and, highway system. So much of that and various forms of engineering came from major funding coming out, or the internet itself, the ARPANET, major funding coming out of the government, working with the private sector to give them the amount of funds to experiment and to break things and to make make things happen that way. So I think there should be a lot more funding and a lot more initiatives like Hamilton to. I basically lobbied for 5 Hamiltons to be going, different feds, all doing different things. Get Stanford and the San Francisco Fed going, and we got Hamilton, which is great. But I definitely think we need more government support, but not to squelch innovation, but to fund it.
It's really interesting that where it is that American innovation can be and where research can best be targeted. And I think there are we'll perhaps weigh it up a bit later, lots of quite valid privacy concerns about what a CBDC could be. Now, there are lots of solutions within your kind of toolkit as to what feasibly could provide that kind of privacy, but we're still not all of that technology is mature, and it's really interesting. And I think this is correct, and I think I'm talking out of school, how the American system is beginning to direct research funding into those areas to examine that kind of work, because I personally can't see a retail CBDC in this country that doesn't have at least banking-like privacy, and that's a really good question of what banking-like privacy really is. But Jamil, where do you see the American role here? You mentioned how you thought that it absolutely would be a thought leader here. How do you see, I guess, to shift the question slightly, how do you see the political environment, and do you think it's something that is going to facilitate this kind of work and this kind of research that Jim is sort of calling for?
Well, this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of the central banks that we do talk to. Not all of them, but some of them, many of them, I would say most of them, are looking for leadership in this space, and they're looking for American leadership. And being an American, I want America to lead, right? I want America to be the best in everything that it could be, right? So, but maybe we're not there in this thing. Maybe we're there for other things. And maybe we will catch up at some point in time in terms of leadership. And I do agree that better right than first, right? So it may take time because it's an extremely complex problem. I think what's happening globally today, geopolitically, globally, I think we're more polarized. What's happening in Russia and Ukraine, there's more polarization geopolitically. I think for the U.S. to continue to be a leader in the space is going to be important. But that doesn't mean to go it alone. It means to bring all the right parties together, build the right coalitions, the right consortiums to move forward. And I think that's going to be critical. And it's not going to be a top-down thing. I think it's going to be peers coming together and building systems in maybe different ways, building technology in a way that maybe it wasn't built the past 30 years. Like, for example, for it to be open source. Right? I think it's very, very critical. And so I think if we can move in that direction, and my point is that Hamilton was a movement in that direction. Maybe not entirely as much as we would want it to be, but it was a big step forward. And I think it opened up a lot of eyes across the world. A lot of central banks looked at the paper that came out, which is a brilliant paper, and said, I never even thought about these things, and now I can see some of the math behind it, right? And how do I test? Oh, this is how I test. I went to, I'm not going to mention the country. It's next to Russia. I was there last year. I was there last year in a conference.
How next to Russia?
It's not too next to. And I was in the meeting with the central bank there, and they didn't even know how to test their CBDC. They're like, if we roll out a CBDC, how do we test it? How do we simulate this system would work, and how do we know what adoption will be? And they have these fundamental questions. And for a lot of organizations in the U.S., like Deloitte and things like that, well, we know how to test stuff, right? We know how to test, right? Like you build these things and you can test scalability and availability, and how do you quantify potential adoption? There are techniques and tools you can use. You may not be 100% accurate, but they have these fundamental questions. And so the gap is so wide because a lot of these central banks, maybe not in, let's say, in the Western countries, but they are not really looking at innovation. Their job is to go in and push buttons and run the spreadsheet, and they go home at night and they're done, and they don't think about that, and that's how they've been operating for 30 years.
Yeah, it's really interesting because clearly we're in a kind of cutting edge space. And certainly from the conversations that I have with central banks similar to you, it constantly surprises me the spectrum of capacity and attitudes that exist within different central banks from, the French, despite the fact that they're in the Eurozone, say, we'll do what we want, when we want, couldn't care less. You speak to the Irish and they say, we're in the Eurozone, we don't get a choice of what we do when we do it. And absolutely share your judgment. There are a whole cluster of nations for whom innovating like this is entirely new, and even the beginning of how you might calibrate success in this space is unknown to them. I think
Also important to state, if I can, for 30 seconds,
Yeah.
is that all the CBDCs that have gone to production have failed. The ones that have gone into the market,
Yep.
it's 100% failure rate.
Yep.
Yeah, it's really
Right,
interesting.
and so-
If you look at the adoption rate from the Bahamas or Jamaica, actually,
Right.
you have to
I
kind of
don't mention any
incentivize
names,
adoption.
but
Yeah.
there was one country where their infrastructure was down for like a better part of 2 months.
Yeah.
Right, and so I think Project Hamilton is kind of a guiding light for countries like that and say, look, think about these kinds of things before you rush too fast. And so I view Hamilton as a learning tool, as an education tool. Like, look at these things, these are the issues, and there's a source code, train your people to understand not just the technical side, obviously the policy side and all that. Yeah.
And Ben, how do you see it? I mean, I guess
It's
you.
Roy. Ben is
Oh
Roy.
my God, I'm so sorry. That is.
If I get a cent by now, I won't be working for Deloitte, I'll be retired.
No, I know.
So a couple of points. Let's start with CBDC discussion was mostly a knee-jerk reaction to Project Libra. Let's just all agree to that, right? So that's point number one. I think you touched upon the other item, which is most of the use cases or most of the projects that have gone live have been a failure, but you learn upon them, as you've noted. If you look through and you don't follow Atlantic Council website and they carry through kind of percentages, we are looking at, I think, 87 or 90% of worldwide countries exploring CBDC. So this is also a journey. I want to hone in on the point that you mentioned about consortium and adoption, because I think that's, if I can look at RLN and look at the benefit wasn't the technology again. The technology was just an enabler. The benefit was having the private of public, but even private entities sitting around and exploring and discussing the issues and trying to explore it and building upon it and getting some guidance from the public sector, from the New York Innovation Center. And the BIS just recently, because the BIS has been running a number of projects in this space, and they came across, for those who don't follow, the idea of a unified ledger. That's their branding, but if you read behind it, it's really RLN, just with another name, which is fine. And one of the discussions the consortium we've been having with them is building an RLN-like or unified ledger-like exercise where they'll bring in global central banks. So it will be global central banks and private side to try to explore on an RLN-like. So you'll be exploring multi-CBDCs, you'll be exploring multi-tokenized version. Again, use case needs to be finalized. But again, to your point, building another brick into the knowledge of how we progress the broader financial system. So I think that's where at least from my purview, that's where we're going to move into.
And is that a sneak peek into what the next phase of RLN looks like? Or
It's not a sneak peek because it will have to be built, but that's the discussions that's been happening there. If you think about, it took us 8 months to get through the New York Innovation Center and to get the US consortium. We think about globally how that evolved, but there is interest from global nations or global central banks to keep on exploring it, because again, they've seen the benefits of an RLN-like or an Hamilton-like project where they share the knowledge. Because to your point, the leadership is not just sitting in the US. ECB is doing stuff, on retail side, the BOE is doing on the retail side, ECB is exploring, Brazil is moving ahead. So there's got to be some sort of sharing of information between the central banks, and that's the benefit they want to get out of it.
And do you see that that is the role for the American private sector exclusively in collaboration? What is the kind of mix there?
It will be, and again, it won't be an American-led. It cannot be an American-led private sector. It's got to be a combination of, global financial. First of all, it cannot be just a big boys club, right? So we got to make sure that we get enough adoption from the major global players. But then you think about, regional banks in France or regional banks in Switzerland or a regional bank in Saudi Arabia or any other countries, depending who are the players, all take part of it as well, because if not, you won't get global adoption. We have the same issue that you have with, with the sand dollar, for example, where people just don't like to use it because they have other solutions that are already sitting on their phone with, whatever other platforms that exist today, so there's no difference.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you think about what it looks like from a user perspective. It is ultimately, at the end of the day, a retail level.
What's the difference?
It's-
Like you
it's,
got, if you are in the US and offer you today CBDC, retail CBDC, and you got your, it's covered by the central bank, but if you have any other platform, I don't want to name platforms on your phone.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's a product, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the case for consumers to adopt it needs to be made really clearly, and it is a bit of a challenge. I'm not sure if we're taking questions.
Yeah. But
Keep going.
one point that came across that maybe I want to bring up is, because we were asked about the risk of increasing run on the banks, specifically after what happened with SVB and others and the look of it. So this was, if you think about having a CBDC now, are we increased, or what controls do we need to put in place to make sure that another, SVB-like scenario will happen, because the movement of money will just accelerate.
We had talked about some of that. We didn't do a lot with cybersecurity. We did resiliency as far as the platform failing, but not with cybersecurity. But we had discussions about, runs on banks are a possibility. I don't think it's a significant risk, because who wants to move all their money into a non-interest-bearing thing called a CBDC? And I can't imagine of an interest rate on a CBDC in the U.S. But the things you do to eliminate that devalue the product. You could add a fee. Well, it should be free. You could slow it down. You could, do other things to try to limit the money flowing out at a certain speed. Well, they all diminish the value of it. So I'm sure I can't remember if we had any other conversations about what might we do. We did that both for the denial of service type of attacks and also for slowing down the network so it doesn't hurt the banks as much, which I think is,
It's interesting, isn't it, where there's a sort of a theory of thought that says you want it to be good enough to offer perhaps system resiliency, perhaps some level of consumer protection if it looks like privacy, but not so successful that it disintermediates the banks. It's an interesting challenge, and it's certainly one that, from I guess a purely private sector perspective that thinks about sort of products, the idea of designing a product that's good but not too good is a really interesting kind of.
I don't believe that. I just don't think you should be in the game if that's your goal.
Precisely, it looks very different, and it feels as though what you come up with there is use cases and things that it can be
something that
used
can
for.
be innovated on top of. I mean, there's potential for innovation. We should have said earlier on tonight, and I realized we didn't. Hamilton was a retail CBDC, so for use by humans and businesses versus a wholesale, with the RLN and other projects like Project Ubin are basically interbank transfer. But I think if you're going to do it, I think you have to do it with assuming you're going to be fully successful, wildly successful. But we were going to build a core platform, and I think others, banks and fintechs and others, could innovate on top of it to add value, like micropayments or IoT payments or some other ways of creating a privacy that's better than the other guys or something. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's an elimination as much as building a platform for more things to happen.
Yeah, and I guess it sort of takes us onto sort of what Hamilton looks like next, and I guess pivot to Nia and you, Jim. What do you think it looks like next? What is next for Project Hamilton?
Well, I think Project Hamilton, as a project, has run its course. So, it's not something that was meant
to be clear, as of the end of the year, or actually earlier this year, the project is ended.
Yeah, and
finished.
It's very natural for research collaborations to sort of be of a limited time frame. And so I think, we did what we did. It has opened an even bigger box of questions, is the way that I would put it. What we focused on there, I think, was really the core of the technology stack, the very, inside of it. And as Jim said, this is always something that we intended to be a platform that other people would build upon. Jim did say it was a retail CBDC, and I think that was the use case we had in the back of our heads. That's not the only thing it could be used for. It can do transaction processing generally. That's what it can do. I think you can build a lot of different stuff around it. And so, there are a lot of different questions that remain to be answered that we didn't get to because, it takes time to do these things. What is the right level of programmability for something like this? Part of the appeal of such a new technology, the reason that it differs from the apps that I have on my phone to use and make transfers is that, cryptocurrency, you can write programs that can make it do more complicated things, which is really exciting. And, you can do escrow, you can do time lock payments, you can build applications that use payments in new and exciting ways. So there's whole levels of functionality to unlock there that we haven't really examined. And then something I think we were going to talk about but haven't talked about yet is privacy, right? And I think this is such an important question because there have been so many misconceptions out there as to what a central bank digital currency means intrinsically. Something that we were very careful about with Project Hamilton is we wanted to design a transaction processor that really stored very, very little data inside the transaction processor. So you are not going to find names, you are not going to find addresses, you are not going to find social security numbers, and you're not even going to find amounts inside the core transaction processor. The way that we designed it is that the core transaction processor, really, it's there to do one job. It's there to make sure that money is moved in a secure way, and it's there to make sure that money is preserved, the balance of money is preserved. And so we designed it that way, thinking that there would be layers outside of it that would deal with some of these important issues around authentication and checking identities and things like that. And so we really designed it with that in mind. And so I think, unfortunately, there's this misconception that a central bank digital currency means the government can see all of your transactions. And I'm here to tell you it does not have to mean that. We have technology that can protect even the most, Hamilton goes so far, you can go even further than Hamilton went, and you can really hide a lot of data. You can use various types of privacy enhancing technologies in order to do that. And so that's a big part of our work going forward is really, there's been a lot of theoretical papers on this, and there has been an amazing amount of work in the cryptocurrency space, but which is a slightly different space than what we're dealing with. And so a big part of our work going forward is showing that these techniques are practical and can be built and operate at scale, and that they can work inside of a regulated system where you need to do things like sanctions compliance and things like that. So that's a big part of what we're doing going forward.
Let me add to that because it really is another part of what Hamilton tried to do, and this is sort of the inside baseball of the Fed, is, so I grew up in Boston. If you've seen Boston streets, they're crazy because we pave cow paths, right? That's how Boston was designed originally. So every speech I've ever done, I said, let's not pave the cow paths. Let's just not build something to match the policies of today. We had no policy decisions when we did Hamilton. We still don't. But what we said is let's design it flexibly enough to handle various policy options. And what we wanted to do was in the next phase of work, we did some of it, but not as much as I would have wished we could, is we wanted to show the policymakers what else is possible. Like, can I maximize privacy and still catch the bad guys? I was actually, I got yelled at for this, but I even talked about banks hate doing sanctions. They hate doing compliance. It doesn't work. It's expensive. So why don't we put a public-private utility in front of the CBDC that does all the sanctions, and nobody sees the data except that utility, and we'll do zero-knowledge proofs at scale and only kick out the ones where you have a hit. And so we can, that's not the cow path is doing it the old way. So that's the kind of thinking we have to do going forward on privacy options, and not just the technology, but how can we change the policymakers' mind about what's possible. And I'll just say that not being at the Fed now, I'm not privy to the discussions. The Boston Fed, most of the people there are still working on the next phase of the project, which is being run out of Washington. But I'm just not privy, and they have not been as vocal as I've always been on Hamilton. I was on the top of every mountain yelling it, and they're just being a little quieter in DC at the moment. But they're still moving forward with it. They're still hiring. They're still committed to the project. It's just, not at the same pace or to looking like what Hamilton did.
And just before I ask Roy and Jamil to answer the same sort of question on I guess, privacy, really. Just wanted to give a shout out that question was asked by Stephen Harrington at Seniors Research Partners, whose question was whether the payment system will be used to limit individual financial resources or coercive behavior. This, which is a very graceful way of asking a question that was put to me by someone saying, will Joe Biden use CBDC to stop me buying red meat?
So two things quickly. Yes, you should be eating, but no. One, some countries think about interest rates to be able to do a new monetary policy tool. I can't imagine ever having that in the States. We're not going to make a negative interest rate so you spend your money. I can't believe we're going to coerce people like that. And the Fed builds and runs a lot of payment systems. If you get paid electronically for your payroll, it goes with the Fed mostly, or the New York consortium of New York banks. If you write a check, most of those go through the Fed, wire transfers. We already have all that data, and much more than Hamilton ever had. So, just a message to say, just because we have your data, we're not going to be exposing it to anybody else. We don't expose it to each other in the Fed. We're very protective of that. And that's just, the reality, though. People may not trust that, but that's how things work today.
Yeah, Jamil?
So last year what we announced was a CBDC manifesto. This was signed by, I think, like 200 organizations, academics. If you go to cbdcmanifesto.com, and the idea was like any work that is being done around CBDCs should adhere to this manifesto. And then the manifesto had 5 points. The second point was about privacy. And so we said that this is something that banks must attend to, right? And so, but to Jim's point, and from a technology point of view, it's not clear what privacy is. Like, what do we mean by privacy? Like, I can accumulate data about you without you even giving me anything, right? I can do. You have metadata. I can do all kinds of things now. And then with AI now becoming more prevalent, there's a lot more privacy concerns there than I would be worried about in a CBDC. But can a quote unquote evil state do something with a CBDC that can really erode privacy significantly? And I think we can see that in some countries in the world that have very prevalent CBDC. I'm not going to mention the name. One of our clients is the State Department. The U.S. State Department is a client of ours, is a CBDC think tank. And we've done a lot of research around that CBDC, and it is very erosive of personal privacy. So even if we can't define privacy, we can say, well, there's a relative erosion of privacy in this system erodes privacy in this way, and this system erodes privacy in that way. And there are uses of CBDC that completely eliminate all kinds of privacy unless you're buying diapers, right? And then you're entitled to your privacy. But the minute you buy anything more than that, there are people that know. And so I think it really depends. It's case by case. And maybe America can lead in that as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's definitely absolutely jurisdictional in terms of who the evil is you want to hide your data from, whether it's the state or whether it's private sector. And it astonishes me what's within the Bank Secrecy Act if you're ever particularly worried about who could see your data. If only it was champagne.
Too early.
Roy, final word, I guess.
I think I'll just hone in on what Jamil said, right? Because I agree with the other point. At the end of the day, it's all up to how the design of the risk exists, right? Let's not kid ourselves, right? It all depends. It depends which country you are, and then what's the politics behind it. You can surveil whatever you want at the end of the day, depending how the coin or the CBDC is designed, right? So you will elect what CBDC you want to use and where you want to live. I mean, at the end of the day, you elect which country you want to live in. It is a risk. We cannot not acknowledge it, right? Should you have someone who come here and say, I want to have a CBDC and I want to monitor everything you do, including making sure that you don't use it to buy any illicit products, it's possible, right? And that's the design elements are there. But the question is how the nation state will roll it out.
Yeah, and I guess it speaks to where everyone is starting their particular journey and what attitude they have to the state, because this is a well-regulated nation and a mature payments environment.
Yep.
The idea that that compliance is going to fall out the door on anyone at any given bank that you might have even if as a PSP layer start sharing data is a really interesting question. And I guess having Jim here who can speak freely and still say we won't be doing that is at least reassuring to me. We've actually got 5 minutes left, and Mike asked me to leave 5 minutes for him to wrap up. So with that, I guess I thank my panelists, Roy, Jamil, Jim, and Nia. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. This was really good. Is there one coin to rule the world? No. All the CBDCs that have gone into production have failed, 80%, but you can learn from failure, as we all know. 87% of the worldwide countries are exploring CBDC. It cannot be an American-led, it cannot be a big boys club. Great. Banks and fintechs can build on top of the CBDC, like micropayments, et cetera. The CBDC in that unnamed country that I think everybody knows what they're talking about is very erosive of privacy. And I'll just add, that's why it's important for the U.S. to develop a CBDC that we can build into the freedom of the U.S. and export that to countries that are looking for CBDC as a service. Let's not pave the cow paths. I knew it would come up. I'm so
Mike heard it a few times.
That's great. So thanks a lot for coming. Please consider joining the BBA as an individual member. This is why we're doing this, and we need your support financially, $100 a year. Next Wednesday night, John Hargrave. John, where are you? Over here, is going to be hosting a members-only workshop on Layer 1 technologies, Layer 1 blockchains. So rated and reviewed. This would be a really good little 1 hour, deep dive into Layer 1s. So next up is the Summer Social from 5 to 6:30 out. Thank you again to Fidelity for hosting this. Really appreciate it. And then after the, oh, by the way, if you're under 21, is there anybody under 21 in here? Okay. I was just going to say, give your drink ticket away. Or if you're enterprising, sell it. And if you didn't get a drink ticket, see me, I'll get you one. And then the after party is at the Trillium Brewery at 6:30 to whenever. So thanks a lot for coming. Really appreciate it.